All right, thank you there. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you to all of you for inviting me to speak here tonight. It's my first time that I'm going to talk about spirituality, so I'm a little bit nervous as a scientist doing this, but I think this audience is like the perfect audience for me to do this for the first time. So and I'm really delighted to be here. I want this to be a space where we take a moment to just feel some awe at the universe. It's a bit of a grim day today, but look, we exist, we're conscious right here, right now. We have vastly complex minds. We're situated in an exquisitely vast and complex universe that does obey some beautiful mathematical laws. It's amazing, and understanding the ultimate nature of all this, it's just the most exciting and important pursuit. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this. So, science, spirituality, and psychedelics. Science and spirituality, they're often seen as completely separate pursuits. Although I do believe that for those really paying attention, I believe they're not. Here's me at a meditation retreat last year. There were several people there who were surprised, actually, to see a scientist there. However, amongst my colleagues who research the neuroscience of consciousness, I think many of us would go to meditation retreats, and many would actually identify themselves as spiritual people. Some of us more loudly than others. So there's possibly a range of opinions in the audience tonight, maybe from those who already consider it obvious that science can go hand in hand with spirituality. I think maybe that is the case amongst a lot of the psychedelic scene, but maybe there are some people who are perhaps not so sure. In any case, it does seem like for the past few hundred years that science has often been a destroyer of spirituality, kind of increasingly relegating our place in a cold, dark universe. It makes some souls here and there and then cruelly crushes them, breaks every single one of them. In our Western tradition, we went from God making us the pinnacle of life at the centre of the universe and promising the well-behaved a place in eternal heaven, to the Earth orbiting the Sun, which orbits a mediocre galaxy that's just in a random position in a universe containing absolutely gazillions of stars and galaxies, to being descended from beasts via random mutations. But actually, I think that 20th century physics and 21st century physics and neuroscience is actually starting to reverse this. And I'm going to assert now that science really can actually be a maker of spirituality. Incidentally, just going back to Michelangelo's creation there, I don't know how many of you know this, but God there is actually inside a brain. So I don't know exactly what Michelangelo was thinking there. People have speculated on that, but I don't know. Okay, so as was said, I started my academic journey with a degree in mathematics and a PhD in theoretical particle physics in string theory. And always interested in the really fundamental nature of reality. But along the way there, I learned Einstein's theory of relativity, and from studying that, I realised that time is kind of an illusion. So really past, present and future actually exist equally. So there's no time it is right now in the universe, and there's no such thing as before you're born or after you die, out there in the universe. So that was the first of my two, what I would call spiritual insights, and one chunk of my talk will be on that. After my PhD, I moved into mathematical neuroscience research, and after a couple of years of doing that, became a founding member of the Sussex Centre for Consciousness Science, which was then called the Sussex Centre. And within a few years of studying consciousness, I became a panpsychist. Panpsychist of sorts. I'll sort of, you'll get the flavour of panpsychism that I believe in. I'll get into the nuance of that. But essentially, this is that consciousness is a fundamental property of matter. So it's as fundamental as mass or electric charge, and we're all in some sense part of one ginormous cosmic being. So that was my second spiritual insight, and the first part of my talk will actually be on that, and all the most important insights I've gained sort of during the last 15 years here on like what is the fundamental physical substrate of consciousness. And psychedelics. So actually I do want to say, I want to stress that the two key spiritual positions that I'm going to present come to me through science and not psychedelics. Yeah, we'll talk about psychedelics. We will talk about psychedelics. Yeah, so putting a chemical in your brain leads many people to similar insights, which is absolutely fascinating. How can that be? So I'll discuss that in the third part of my talk. Yeah. The disclaimer, I do not encourage illegal activities, but I do believe psychedelics are a valid path to achieving spiritual insight. I do believe that. And there's a scientific basis for some of the typical spiritual insights that that are often gained. Okay, let's crack on then with panpsychism and the neuroscience of consciousness. There's a few different definitions. I'll just kind of give you a few to really get you into the thinking. So, the nature of all matter involves consciousness. My view on it is maybe an individual particle may not itself have any consciousness, but it's likely that it takes very few interacting particles to produce a very elemental form of microconsciousness. As soon as you have an interaction between two things, there's microconsciousness. I'll explain why I think that from some neuroscience in a bit when I get on to integrated information theory. Everything has potential for consciousness, and everything is in some sense the same being, because it's made of the same stuff, and consciousness arises from configurations of matter. We're in some sense part of a continuous mass that has a load of conscious experiences all over the place at many different times. Now, I should say up front a little bit about what my definition of consciousness is, because people have different definitions of that. Some people even, they consider they only become conscious after taking a psychedelic or something. I have a more broad definition of consciousness. It's any awareness of something, any subjective experience. When there is consciousness, there is being, and it is something it is like to be that being. Intuitively, consciousness is what disappears every night when you fall into dreamless sleep, flickers in and out during the dreamy hours of the early morning, and then hopefully comes back reasonably quickly, hopefully ahead of the alarm clock in the morning. So those are all kind of definitions. We don't have a precise definition of consciousness, but people in the burgeoning neuroscience consciousness community are like, we just got to get on with it. We've got loads of brain data. We know roughly what it is. We be brave and get on with it. All right, so let's argue for panpsychism. It's a fairly simple argument, I think, really. So you can start with Descartes, 17th century philosopher, famously observed, "I think, therefore I am." So your first-person experience proves that consciousness actually does exist. It's the only thing we can be certain of. A basic faith in science reveals that the most likely generator of your consciousness is the brain inside your head, maybe working together with some other parts of your body. You can trust that other people really are conscious when they say they are, because other people look more or less like you and have brains that behave more or less like yours. Curiously, there are no atoms with your particular name on them. Atoms come and go from your body. So you're just a bundle of conscious experiences being generated by a bunch of atoms connected in a certain way. Consciousness is just a property of the matter in the universe. If matter arranges itself in a certain way, conscious experiences happen. The philosopher Philip Goff put it like this. He says, we know that some material entities' brains have an intrinsically consciousness involving nature. We have no clue as to the intrinsic nature of any other material entities, but the most simple, elegant, parsimonious hypothesis is that the nature of the stuff outside of brains is continuous with that of brains in also being consciousness involving. we may all be at different stages of contemplating panpsychism, and it is very easy to ridicule this at first. I mean, there've been famous articles like this one that was taking the mickey a bit out of integrated information theory, which I'm going to come on to. But it's not saying that rocks or trees or spoons or anything like that is like, sitting there contemplating the universe the way I am. If the atoms in those spoons were to become part of certain regions of your brain, then these atoms would contribute to the generation of a rich conscious experience. They're made of the same stuff as you and me. So, what's the problem with them having some very, very elemental form of consciousness within a spoon? But actually, a spoon itself wouldn't be conscious in its entirety. So when I talk about integrated information theory, like one side of a spoon is not like wired to the other side of the spoon, like the way the brain is wired up from one side to the other. So there's nothing there creating like a coherent information processor. So it's actually just lots of micro-consciousnesses, not like one unified consciousness. Giulio Tononi, the author of integrated information theory, just call this ontological dust. Like, what's the problem of ontological dust everywhere? There's me and everyone in this room. We've got these marvellous big consciousnesses, and then, there might be some ontological dust everywhere. I quite like that term. Anyway, so the serious objection to panpsychism, though, is the combination problem. So, like, if everything is conscious, how do multiple small things join together to create one big conscious human being? How do you ever get anything other than ontological dust? Alternatively, why do I only experience the contents of my head and not also the contents of other people's heads simultaneously? Why is it not just one cosmic consciousness with just, some omniscient God thing? How does a line get drawn around the physical substrates of distinct conscious experiences? Now, that's a good, that's the big question. We haven't solved it, but I think I can imagine this being solved. And in fact, integrated information theory has made a very valiant attempt to do so. And we'll see that. Before I do that, I'll just deal with materialism, which is like the main contender to panpsychism, really. I mean, there's other philosophical positions, but I think if we're doing science, there might be some people who might argue with me later, but the main contender is materialism. Which has really been the tacitly dominant sort of view amongst most scientists and sort of science followers, I think, in last century or so. And so materialism is that only matter and not consciousness is fundamental. So consciousness is not a fundamental property of matter. And consciousness somehow results from material interactions when matter gets complex enough. The thing is, work on consciousness starting from materialism just never gets anywhere at finding what this is. So you've got all these individual neurons that are supposedly not conscious, and then, we look at how they work together, and they come together and, they enable, you've detected an image now. You can see, like, a nice picture of, vase of flowers. But then it turns out we can detect images consciously and unconsciously. So when we detect an image consciously, it's like penetrates deeper in the brain and for longer. Wow. But why does that lead to consciousness when there was no consciousness before? Why would anything be conscious? We've got no idea from that line of reasoning why anything would be conscious. And we can understand how the brain does perception, how it, makes a guess at what's out there, but why would anything be conscious? This is the so-called hard problem of consciousness, the philosopher David Chalmers. Studying all the mechanisms that exist in the brain, how on earth would we ever derive that such and such set of mechanisms is generating consciousness? There's just not a hint of a solution to the hard problem with materialism. I've been around consciousness conferences a long time. Okay, so let's talk about integrated information theory. I think this is the only theory that has some inkling into what might be the fundamental physical substrate of consciousness. And this theory supposes a certain flavour of panpsychism. It's very controversial, and it's not correct as stands, but I think it's really worthwhile to study it. Because, I think, making progress will come through studying this, I think. So the philosophy of integrated information theory goes as follows. It says, okay, look, consciousness exists. That's a fact. Now, what are the most fundamental properties of consciousness? You can introspect, and you come up with what seems to be the most sort of universal properties of consciousness. Then it says that these properties must be reflected in the physical substrate. And then it builds a mathematical formula based on a translation of these into physics. This is an ambitious panpsychism formula that will describe the level and contents of consciousness, anything that actually has any consciousness. So you can see this is extremely intriguing for me coming into consciousness science from physics. It's extremely creative, I think. It's genius, really audacious. It's also maddening because it is actually wrong, and it's often obfuscating wrong. Yeah, it's often the discussions on it obfuscating. They're not always honest. Proponents of IoT about the problems with it, and then the people who critique it often don't understand it, and it gets maddening. And it's occupied much of my time here at Sussex, actually, working with it in various ways, trying to make it better, discussing it. And it keeps drawing me back in for another swing. And I'm about to have another swing at it, commenting on it. So let's have a look at a few of these axioms. So the first one is consciousness exists. And you've got integration. So integration, that means that experience is unified. So it cannot be subdivided into parts that are experienced separately. So you experience this whole room and seen in front of you all at once. You don't experience one corner of the room at one moment and then another the next. Like it's all of a piece. So your experience consists of integrated information from across your entire visual field. This means there needs to be a lot of interconnections between the components or neurons. That's got to be reflected in the substrate. The really innovative one in this theory is this one here, information. So this says that conscious experiences are informative in the sense that each experience is specific and in some sense rules out other potential experiences that were a priori possible. So just think of the vast repertoire of possible conscious experiences you could have. Go through your life and you just have all these different conscious experiences. Maybe one or two of you may have seen this slide, but I don't think you have because I've rearranged it. I don't think I've spoken in this room before. Visual scene in front of you is different from any visual experience you've ever had before. So that means that in the substrate, there need to be a lot of possible patterns of activity that could happen. Like each experience you have will be a slightly different pattern. So that leads to a sort of diagram like this for sort of how the brain might be connected. Like if all your neurons are not connected at all, then there's no way you're going to experience the whole of this room, gist of this whole scene in front of you all at once. You're only going to experience fragments. But if everything's kind of connected to everything in the same way, then how are you going to get a load of different activity patterns? You're just going to have the same thing over and over again. Everything's active, everything's not active. So what you need is a good amount of connectivity, but there needs to be a lot of diversity there, a lot of diverse structure going on. So that's a really good insight. Then you've got composition, experiences structure. There's lots of different aspects to an experience. So you might have an object, like a piano. You might have a colour, a book. Lots of spatial locations, sounds, various emotions. This is multifaceted. So, we won't get into so much detail on that one, but that gets put in there as well. So how are these things put into mathematics, I'm not going to give you equations except for that nice visual which someone created for us once. So just informally what you do is, so you maybe say for doing this in the brain, so you record voltages from a bunch of neurons in the brain, and you see how well you can use one result to predict earlier and later results, earlier and later readings from the reading you've just got. So information then is the reduction in uncertainty you get from that. There's a lot of information there right now. If there are lots of different patterns of activity that do occur, so that's like the whole point there of big repertoire of conscious experiences, there needs to be a lot of different patterns that happen. But then there's a lot of information if, having observed what the pattern is now, the possible patterns in the recent past are much narrowed down. That's what's put into mathematics, those conditions. And then you've got integration, which is essentially how much worse can I predict if I imagine I just cut the whole thing in two and I don't know what's just come down all the cut wires. So if I've got here, just imagine I've got like two neurons, like one's talking to two and three's talking to four, but those two halves are not talking to each other. Then I could cut down the middle and there's no loss of information. So I'm not ruling out anything that might have just happened by considering stuff across the cut. Makes no difference. So this whole thing, there'd be no unified consciousness here, no combination. So you see how we're getting at the combination problem a bit here. This might have a micro-consciousness and this might have a micro-consciousness, but overall nothing. Whereas if there are connections, then I kind of need to know what was coming down this wire in order to make my best prediction of what was happening just now. If I cut that and no longer know what was coming down that wire, then my predictions are less good. Because it's just sort of detective work, like figuring out what just happened based on the wiring diagram, sort of extrapolate back from what was just going on. And things influence each other. So in this case, there would be some consciousness potentially in this system. So that's all sort of put into mathematics. And the key components you end up with are this sort of measure phi, Greek letter phi, system integrated information, essentially the information generated by a whole system that's above and beyond the parts. And so that's used to find where consciousness resides. So that's your combination problem, potentially, or hypothetical solution to it. So again, you can imagine these things being neurons, and which set of neurons are contributing to consciousness. Basically, you look at any set of neurons, and if it overlaps with another set at all that has a higher phi, then that's not substrate of consciousness. It's only the sort of set of neurons for which you get this sort of maximum phi value. So here, you're at 0.12, but if you did the whole thing, you'd only end up with 0.003. So it's this one is conscious, and then there might be a separate micro-consciousness that's not overlapping. So I talked about the components being neurons, but the components could be anything at all of any size. You can apply this to any description of a system, physical thing. You find some maximum of phi, and that is some consciousness. That is like a unified consciousness. Anything overlapping with has to have a smaller phi for that to be conscious. And then conscious contents then are generated via the integrated information. Various subregions generate about the past and future of other subregions. So once you've identified where your consciousness is, then you start applying the whole formula to a load of different subregions. And that then generates a sort of structure of conscious experience. Okay, well, that was about quick as I can explain phi to you. The trouble is, the whole thing's riddled with maths and physics problems anyway. Fortunately, there is plenty of evidence that integrated information theory has some stuff correct. So one thing we can do is we can do pattern counting in EEG. So we put a load of electrodes on someone's scalp, and we look at the patterns that happen. And this can tell you how conscious someone is. So if you imagine these are a bunch of electrodes on someone's scalp, we're looking down on it. Typically when you're unconscious, you don't see that many patterns. So you might just see everything getting active and then everything not being active again. Incidentally, the difference between conscious and unconscious brain activity is not to do with just the overall intensity of activity. So your brain can be just as active overall in terms of the intensity of electrical activity, conscious and unconscious. So, but what we see when you're conscious is you see, one lot of electrodes, you get activity at one lot of electrodes, and then the next moment, another lot, and then the next moment, another lot, and the next moment, another lot. Each time a different pattern. Again, that's it's reflecting the fact that you've got a large repertoire of possible experiences you could have. Experiences are rich and multifaceted. Whereas when you're unconscious, there's nothing it's like to be you. So there's nothing going on. So that's pretty cool. That's some really nice experimental evidence that integrated information theory could be on the right track. And then we do see integration as well. We see connection. So the way we can see that the brain is, regions are actually communicating with each other. We hit the brain with a burst of magnetic stimulation, put a magnetic coil above the scalp, let out a magnetic pulse, and we measure the response in the EEG. And basically, when you're awake, the response travels all over the scalp. Whereas when you're unconscious, so they've done this under various anaesthetics and in deep sleep. They also do this on coma patients as well, and helping potential clinical applications there. Response doesn't spread. So there's a breakdown of integration. You're not tying everything together. You're not going to see this whole room. So that key thing that I said, that you have to have lots of patterns of activity and lots of connections, that's upheld in the evidence. So that's encouraging for this whole line of thought, and I think really exciting. So what's the problem with IIT? So the maths is riddled with problems, which I can't really go into in a talk like this. One thing is that there's lots of different possible mathematical formulae you can write down. There's lots of different ways of measuring information, lots of different ways of measuring integration, like cutting the system in two. And they don't all give the same answers. Your amount of consciousness you have and the content of your consciousness is very definite. It has to be one answer. And then often these formulae don't actually output a value for phi at all. They often just don't work. Now, a lot of so getting away from those things, there's a famous critique made by a quantum physicist about 10 years ago that kind of shows a misunderstanding. So I wanted to kind of just mention that. So it's been critiqued for like an inactive power grid having high phi, so potentially having high consciousness. You have like just a bunch of electrical components just in a grid, and actually not being on at the moment. It's just completely silent. In theory, yes, that can give you high phi. This phi thing comes out big, so in theory that sounds like it has a lot of consciousness. But that's a misunderstanding of the theory. If you actually go into the details, that would be one rather plain conscious experience anyway. So it's not just about having a high phi. And also, for a rich inner life, what you need is actually see lots of different patterns of activity. So your power grid could have lots of different patterns in theory, but in practice, if it's just sitting there inactive, like that's not contemplating the universe. It's like I'm contemplating the universe because I'm cycling through. Like each moment, a different subset of my neurons are active. So that's really a bogus critique, and it's a shame that one hasn't been put to bed. I'm going to write about that one again soon. So the key takeaway, the big topic IIT, has many problems, and I view it as in its infancy. But there is experimental evidence that it has some things right, and an IIT-type theory could potentially solve the combination problem. We've seen that, there's a potential way to solve that. combination problem is how do you go from micro consciousnesses to like a macro consciousness, like a consciousness that I'm having or you're having. How do you draw a line around the physical substrate of one unified consciousness? What I've argued is that to make progress, IoT should integrate with fundamental physics. So fundamental building blocks of the universe are not neurons, and actually in modern physics they're not particles either. They're actually fields. So for each kind of particle there's like literally an energy field. So whenever there's like no particles present, like the field is flat. And when there are particles present, like mathematically what you have is something that looks like a wave or a ripple travelling across this field, and all bumps. So what I've said in this paper was that instead of trying to find a formula in terms of a bunch of neurons, we should try to find a formula that you can apply to a patch of field. And specifically, the electromagnetic field generated by the brain is extremely complex, and that would be why we are very conscious. So I've no idea how to come up with such a formula, but maybe there's some young physicist at some point who maybe comes and jumps on this. That's what I'd love to see happen. And just try to convince you I'm not being like really esoteric here. I'm not saying that neurons don't generate consciousness. It's just another way of looking at the same thing. So neurons are kind of like a scaffolding that channel electric charges in such a way that an extremely complex electromagnetic field can actually emerge. So this can't happen in a vacuum. All right, one more thing before we move on. Yeah, I'm running a bit late. A couple of questions. I'll probably go on a bit longer. Just a few words on quantum mechanics. So there is this kind of mystery. How can the activity from a few centimetres cubed within the brain really be tied together to generate like an integrated, unified conscious experience? It's really weird. Physics intuitively happens at single points in space. Particles change their motion based on the forces acting on them, where they are. So gravity pulls them from a distance, but it's kind of the slope of the nearby gravitational field where the particle is right now that sort of determines how the particle moves. And the only way you get away from that is kind of in the quantum world. We don't know how to interpret quantum mechanics properly, but the key feature is things like you can create two particles heading off in opposite directions, sort of existing in two states at once. Each of them is sort of simultaneously spinning in one direction and spinning in the other direction. But when you measure the spin of one particle, all of a sudden the other particle, all the way over on the other side, now suddenly has to be spinning in the opposite direction of the one you've just measured. Now this still baffles scientists and philosophers, but it does provide a potential mechanism for solving the combination problem. So those particles, when they're created, they're sort of connected in some sense. In quantum mechanics lingo, you used to use the word entangled. So perhaps anything that is entangled forms the substrate of a single unified conscious experience. So I don't want to talk about this for too long because there's not currently much evidence for entanglement in the brain. And there are some theories around this that I'm really not in favour of. There's a lot of nonsense out there. But there are some big name scientists who are now reconsidering whether quantum effects might play a role in generating consciousness. Precisely because, it seems like it could be the only way you can tie things together across a few centimetres, really. Christoph Koch, for example, is someone who seems to have changed his mind on this. I think as more physicists start thinking about consciousness, we might see some progress. The brain generates a very complex electromagnetic field, and there's definitely some quantum mechanical happenings in the brain. So, in the synapses, the gaps between neurons, where neurotransmitter particles carry messages from one neuron to the next, these things sit in quantum superpositions, so they can be a combination of things at once, like the particles simultaneously spinning in two different directions. Let's see if there's a future theory that comes up with some kind of framework that involves quantum. All right. Okay, yeah, so the next parts are going to be shorter, but yeah, probably will go on a little bit longer. So we come to, so we've done panpsychism. So the second spiritual insight. I hope you're ready for some more physics. We're going to do a very brief bit of relativity here, so I hope I haven't already talked too long. But it's amazing because, we're going to see that past, present, and future exist equally. There's no time it is right now in the universe. There's no such thing as before you're born or after you die. And outside of your individual existence, there's no one time. There's only all of time, all over the place. Right, so as I said, this comes from relativity theory, Einstein's theory. So relativity is all about physics being the same whether your laboratory is still or moving. And a key feature of relativity theory is that light always travels at the same speed away from you, no matter how you are moving. And the consequence of this is that the flow of time depends on how you move. Once you have the speed of light constant, then other things have to change. Now, this has been extremely well verified. So you can use clocks with all kinds of different mechanisms for measuring time. And so you've got satellites that orbit the Earth. They move very fast. And clocks on board satellites do tick slower than clocks on Earth. And actually, GPS navigation that your phones use require this correction to be taken into account. GPS would not work if not for this. So even on Earth, we can only approximately come up with an agreed time it is right now. Things get really amazing when you start doing thought experiments with the whole universe. So I'm going to give you the simplest possible derivation that relativity takes you to the conclusion that everything happens simultaneously. This won't take too long, actually. I've adapted this from Sabine Hossenfelder's excellent book, Existential Physics. So in a vacuum, light always travels at the same speed and always in a straight line. And for everyone, no matter how they're moving relative to Earth, Sun, or other people. So what we do is we draw space-time diagrams like this. So you have time on one axis, and then usually we just show one space dimension. We can sort of ignore the other two. We can just do it show the one direction that the light is moving. So this is some person, Alice, her so-called rest frame. So she's sitting still and just moving in time, like this. And because light is always going at the same speed, if I set the right units, it'll always move upwards at 45 degrees in a space-time graph. So light beam sent by Alice. Okay, it could go this direction or that direction, but it'll always go at the same angle. It's always going to make the same progress in space per certain unit time. Consider one scenario in which two things happen at the same time for Alice. So Alice is standing still, and she set up two mirrors a certain distance away from her. And they're standing still, so the mirrors are just going vertically in this thing, they're just moving through time, and Alice. They're all sitting still in space. And then she sends light towards each of those mirrors. And because she's measured it, that she's precisely in the midpoint between them, she knows the light reaches those mirrors at exactly the same time, because light travels at a constant speed. Now you have someone else called Bob who is moving relative to Alice. So I'm drawing this from Alice's point of view, but Bob is doing the same experiment. So from Bob's point of view, it looks like this. His two light beams are going to hit his mirrors at the same time. But according to Alice, one mirror is heading towards the light and one is heading away from it. And Alice is going to see the light travelling, according to her, at the speed of light as well. So because one mirror is heading towards the light, one is going to yeah, the light, according to Alice, one beam of light is going to hit the mirror before the other. Just because one's coming towards the light and one's going away from the light. So Bob and Alice are going to disagree on whether or not the light reaches the mirrors at the same time. This is just a thing. If the speed of light is the same for everyone, then time can't be the same for everyone. It just, you know, you can't have everything being the same. Now, before Einstein, you thought, yeah, time is the same. But yeah, no, it's the speed of light that's the same thing. So we've got 2 points, x and y, that are not at the same time for Alice, but are at the same time for Bob. Right, now this can generalise then, so you can do your sort of thought experiment. And there's nothing special about these 2 points, so just, you know. Any 2 points reachable by 2 different laser beams emitted by Alice then at the same time. In theory, simultaneous according to someone, so I could actually put these 2 points, they could be anywhere along these 2 light beams that Alice has set out. There was nothing special about what I showed on the previous slide. If there's a bigger difference in time according to Alice, then Bob just has to be moving a little bit faster in order for him to see those things at the same time. So this will be any pair of points then joined by a line less than 45 degrees from horizontal. So that's any 2 events, yeah, because to get from this light beam to the other light beam, you've got to be less than 45 degrees, otherwise you won't actually be making it across. So this means any 2 so-called space-like events, so these are things that are far enough apart in space relative to time that light sent from the earlier one to the later one, from Alice's perspective, don't get to the spatial location of the other event until after it's happened. Okay, so then this can then be generalised to get this really cool conclusion that, in theory, the same star explodes when you're born and when you die. So consider your lifeline, and yeah, you've got this. So can you see my mouse? No, so I've got to be on this screen, haven't I? Yeah, so you've got your lifeline. You've got this exploding star that, from the perspective of your space and time coordinates, explodes sometime during your life, according to your coordinates, and is far enough away that no light would have time to travel directly between you and the supernova. So we're in the situation that was I was just talking about. So then we can imagine an Alice somewhere in space sending out 2 light beams, one hitting your birth and one hitting the supernova. But by what I've just said on the previous slide, that means that theoretically there's another person, Bob, floating elsewhere in space, for whom the supernova and your birth are happening at the same time, as we just saw from the experiment with the mirrors. If Bob could put mirrors far enough away, which, you do these thought experiments. Then we do another one. There could be another Alice over here, sends out 2 light beams, one hitting your death and one hitting the supernova. And again, that means that theoretically there's another person, Bob, floating elsewhere in space, for whom the supernova and your death are happening at the same time. Ah! Oh my God! I'm not actually tripping, right? Tripping without psychedelics. The supernova and your birth exist simultaneously. Supernova and your death exist simultaneously. Therefore, your birth and your death exist simultaneously. You might have seen that on mushrooms, but it's true. Any 2 events which cannot both be visited by the same light particle then can in theory be seen as happening at the same time. That was what we just said. These things don't need to be, these are just anything that can't be visited, this can't be visited by the same, one light particle connecting them. So they exist simultaneously. But then any 2 event space which can both be visited by the same light particle, so that's, for example, your birth and your death, you could bounce the light beam back and forth. They can be shown by the above argument to exist simultaneously with a 3rd event, thus they can be considered to exist simultaneously. So by extrapolation, everything exists simultaneously. Everything in the universe exists simultaneously. Pretty amazing. So yeah, relativity theory, it's often considered irrelevant to everyday life because, we don't need it to calculate physics of objects on Earth. But this conclusion on time is profound. Time and space gives rise to the experience that each and every conscious experience is separate from all the others, but there's no universal now, there's no way to order them objectively along a single timeline. Hey, so we've got panpsychism and eternalism. Everything has potential for consciousness, everything is in some sense the same being, because it's made of the same stuff, and consciousness arises from configurations of matter. Past, present, and future all coexist. So, I'd say it's an illusion we're separate from others, and we'll never die in a total sense. Those are the spiritual insights. I see this as spiritual. I don't have all the answers, and I don't want to claim that science is capable of providing answers to all the metaphysical questions. So I don't think there's any data on whether there is purpose to existence. One way I like to view, and I get a bit spiritual, is a decentering humanity and remaining neutral on purpose. I think it could perhaps be summarised like this. Consciousness is a mirror through which the universe looks at itself. Just all these conscious experiences all over this place which are just happening for all eternity. I like it. I also stand prepared to update my beliefs in case any new theory or new data come in. Important point to make here is when we do science, the model you believe in is the one that combines being a good fit to the current data with also being simple. This can change either with new theory or with new data. So I was going to my example of gravity, I'm a bit aware of time, so I might skip that. We can come back to that. Theories can be updated. But my position is very simple. Us all being separate beings would be more complicated. If we've all got individual souls, you need an explanation of how all those individual souls interact with all our individual bodies, and how exactly they die and we die. Neuroscience has certainly not found any evidence for any kind of mechanism for this. And a position that includes an omniscient God as well, who cares about us, would also be more complicated. How would that God gain access to the contents of each of our individual conscious experiences? There'd need to be a whole other mechanism that's outside of current physics. People have faith, there's room for faith in this world, but it gets harder to believe because it's a less simple explanation of what we got, and harder to have certainty. Anyway, without having all the answers, I know actually personally firsthand that these insights have potential to bring spiritual meaning and comfort to our lives. So I remember being a teenager and staring up at the night sky and feeling absolute terror about death. And this has gone away. I don't fear death anymore at the moment. I'm only 43, so got to remain humble. But I have faith. I have faith that it's beautiful, and I'm excited to be this mirror. To have all these conscious experiences for all eternity. yeah, let's get on to psychedelics. Yeah, it's been nearly an hour. Let's finally get on to psychedelics. It's amazing that these insights can also be experienced viscerally, firsthand, and with great certainty. It's can happen by going to temple for many years, meditating. If you don't have time for that, psychedelics can bring these insights to the many. So let's talk about psychedelics. Hopefully this will keep you awake after nearly an hour. How is it that putting a chemical in your brain can help with spiritual matters? They're just molecules. They interact with serotonin receptors in your brain, which changes brain connectivity for a short while. And yet. I'll try. I won't take long introducing these substances. So by psychedelics, I'm mostly referring to the classic psychedelics. So it's psilocybin, magic mushrooms, LSD, and ayahuasca, DMT. In normal consciousness, the brain generates an extremely powerful illusion, right? That you're separate from the rest of the universe, that you're an integrated whole, you're a coherent self. This is all useful for survival. It's how it evolved. And it's useful for living your life much of the time. And much of the time it provides comfort to have a sense of who you are and a direction and purpose in life. Things you like and things you don't like. The trouble is, this shields us from ultimate reality, I believe. It creates fear of death, and creates a tendency to get stuck and have a limited view of who you are. The illusion is so very strong, so even if scientifically one can reach the position I've outlined in this talk, I'll be honest, I don't feel it very often. Psychedelics massively change how the different parts of our brains talk to each other. This changes our consciousness drastically. So in particular, the network of brain regions that are active when we contemplate ourself is broken down. These regions kind of become a bit more equally connected to other brain regions, and we experience things really differently for a while. If you're on a large dose, your sense of self can be really altered or possibly even abolished. And it's when this happens that new insights often emerge, and when you might be able to really strongly feel the insights I've presented in this talk. So for those who've not experienced ego disorder, I'm not going to do a show of hands. It's hard to describe. Just a few quotes here from the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, which is often used in academic and clinical research on psychedelics. Experience of oneness or unity with objects and persons perceived in your surroundings. Sense of being outside of time, beyond past and future. Experience of pure being and pure awareness. Experience that all is one. Being in a realm with no space boundaries. These kinds of things. So quite similar to, imagine some of the stuff I've been talking about. So I'll emphasise the experience this is still being generated by the person's brain. I'm not suggesting that suddenly this is being experienced by the entire cosmos or anything like that. But experiencing something like not as you, as your normal self, I think can lead to, that's what I think generates the understanding that the nature of consciousness is perhaps something like I've been talking about. So it's been actually scientifically proven. It's quite amazing. We kind of know this anecdotally, but you have to do science sometimes. It's a large online survey of over 800 participants, and there were statistically significant belief shifts away from materialism and towards panpsychism sustained for 6 months. So I think it was something like more than 50% of those who were kind of neutral at the start, 6 months later they still were feeling more positively towards panpsychism than before their psychedelic experience. And this positively correlated with positive well-being outcomes as well, so it's interesting. Yeah, as I said, yes, it's kind of obvious, right? I mean, the cultural transformation in the 1960s, interest in Eastern spirituality, this is what psychedelics kind of often do to people. And people have a range of experiences, but yeah. Yeah, it's Maharishi there, who was sort of brought transcendental meditation, I think, to the West. And the Beatles, obviously, yeah, most of you know, had big transformations on LSD. So how mystical a psychedelic experience is seems to correlate generally with improvement in well-being. Yeah, there have been several studies showing this, which is really cool. And often in these studies, you really do see amazing, long-lasting changes in well-being. It really is amazing that you can gain spirituality from these molecules. There have been some particularly amazing results on relief of existential distress in cancer patients. I don't want to provide a balanced view. There's a huge amount right now on how brilliant psychedelics are for mental health. There are still risks, and rare on magic mushrooms done safely, done in a safe place with safe people and a stable mindset. But occasionally there is long-lasting distress after a psychedelic experience related to sort of so-called ontological shock, where your belief frameworks are completely upended. And it can lead to confusion about your existence and your sense of purpose in life. It's good to remember this. As you may know, bullshit insights also occur on psychedelic experiences. You may well have seen some hallucinations that weren't real. So when you come down, it can be a bit hard to make sense of it all. What was genuine, what was bullshit? Could not be comforting for everyone if suddenly believing in something like panpsychism and eternalism suddenly constitutes a big ungrounding of your prior beliefs. It's important. So there's a good paper a few months ago, and they identify various ways that this distress can be overcome, and so it's really good that this research is being done. One thing that emerged was interpersonal support and normalization of their experiences. So, I believe the panpsychism insight is genuine, so science can support a belief shift in that direction. There's lots of research that we need to do. How best to do this. But given that we do have a culture of science, I think building some kind of community around scientific spirituality could be helpful for people. I think this is starting to happen, but I think there's a lot further we need to go. These insights have been, after all, been encountered time and time again through rigorous programs of meditation. So people are not alone. And many physicists from the last 100 years do actually share similar beliefs. So here's a quote from Schrödinger, who was one of the fathers of quantum mechanics. There is obviously only one alternative, namely the unification of minds or consciousnesses. Their multiplicity is only apparent. In truth, there is only one mind. This is the doctrine of the Upanishads. The Upanishads come up with just by meditation, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. So people, you're not alone. I think one conclusion is that, we can't avoid for our whole lives grappling with this existential stuff. So we're going to be confronted by it at some point. You're lucky if maybe you reach some stable belief set early on and kind of deal with it. But, basically going into a high-dose psychedelic experience, one should be prepared that it can trigger this, and it may be uncomfortable and require psychological and spiritual work afterwards. You could get fairly sudden spiritual bliss, or you could be ungrounded for a while you sort of figure stuff out. It's great to see initiatives. I like Rosalind Watts's ACER integration initiative that promotes doing a ton of psychological and spiritual work following a psychedelic experience and sort of being ready to do that, to get the most out of it. This will help, I think, if there is some ungrounding. Yeah, I don't know much to say before we get a bit of time for questions. I want to say I do think it's right that generally, because I've talked about spirituality, I think it's right generally that in the psychedelic renaissance, spirituality has been defocused. So there's a huge volume of science showing that 1 or 2 doses of psychedelics coupled with talk therapy can provide lasting relief from a whole range of mental health conditions such as treatment-resistant depression and PTSD, and this is really important work. And sometimes spirituality is part of that breakthrough, but often it's not so much there. And enmeshing too much spiritual stuff into therapy programs could put people off. And we really need a rollout of these medicines and regulators on board. Like, I really want to be clear on that. And psychedelics can do many things. So it's not always spiritual. They can unstick the brain, defrag the brain, yield new ways of thinking about intense psychological material. But on the other hand, ontological shock can happen in these psychedelic therapy sessions. So therapists need a toolkit for helping patients through it if it does happen. So let's see if some kind of scientific spirituality thing can be helpful. Could go on and on and on. I need an hour and 10. Let's wrap up. I have an instinct psychedelics are going to be important for us this century. It's a tough time on the planet with climate change and political climate that tends towards violent and divisive. There are very strong forces that can drag people down into negative thought spirals. The best of times within normal human consciousness, we have a sort of negativity bias that you have to work hard on to counteract. And psychedelics are a really powerful method for doing that, and in a spiritual way. It can help us come to terms with things the way they are, but do need to be used carefully. I really hope, I hope you all continue these discussions. I hope we come up with a regulatory framework for psychedelics that involves both good quality ceremonial leaders, of whatever spiritual stripe, and really good healthcare professionals. I really want to see this rolled out. We need this. So to conclude, science need not be at odds with spirituality. I think most people are on board with that. I'm going to leave that quote there from Albert Einstein. He got it. He got it. A human being is a spatially and temporally limited piece of the whole, what we call the universe. He experiences himself and his feelings as separate from the rest, an optical illusion of his consciousness. The quest for liberation from this bondage or illusion is the only object of true religion. Not nurturing the illusion, but only overcoming it gives us the attainable measure of inner peace. Thank you, everyone.